featured guy.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is Mike and his project to a certain degree it's quite has a certain synergy with the previous project, also citing Montana, also dealing with the relation between the virtual and the real. If the previous project is a blank city, this may be the everything city. We'll see how Mike is.
My thesis title is Through the Looking Glass. Architecture is consumed in both the real physical world as well as through mediums of narration such as photos, books, films, and even video games. Architecture and urban spaces are adapted to these mediums of narrations and never direct copy of their real world counterparts. Their spaces are transformed to cater to the way users access spatial information from these mediums. For example, a real building adapted for a magazine comes in a sequence of pages that need to be flipped to be extracted and accessing spaces, while a building adapted to a film set needs to be altered to cater to the camera and character movement. My thesis studies architectural and urban spaces transformed and adapted into video game narratives. From here, I would like to study the game makers' method of transforming these cities, and then see how it can borrow their design methodology to design architecture that has a articulated narrative. In video games, architectural spaces are redesigned and adapted into the spatial narrative of the game. The architecture becomes a storytelling device and provides the atmosphere, circulation, and lightnings for the game plot to unfold. I studied a game made by EA Games. It's called Battlefield 4, and I actually use it as a reference to see how game makers actually transform a ship into a storytelling device. Studying this game narrative from the game Battlefield 4, the game designer cunningly transformed an aircraft carrier into a stage for a series of events to unfold. While the player moved through it in first-person perspective, they took the ladders of compartments under the ship deck and then carved out a route for the game just by controlling which compartment doors the player can access and which they can't access. And the adaptation also has to work with the carrier spaces, core mechanics of the game, that is navigating spaces through compartment doors. And here, the compartment doors become an important entity to create suspense of what's going on behind the door. And this game is not created by me, but it's just used as a reference. Using the same methodology, I decided to redesign Central Hong Kong in a similar way, which is to transform and adapt Central into a narrative device. I first started, however, with filmmaking. And that is, I tried it out with film and took the parts of the pedestrian bridges that are identical and use that to redesign what we can actually experience. Here I overlay different parts of Central, but although they are different, they form a coherent bridge that makes them look almost the same. So I then proceed to using the video game engine to redesign Central. I redesigned Central into 3 different levels, which I will show later. And this is actually one transformation of Central, and it's based on a historical Central in 1967. And in this first level, I studied all the historical buildings that took part and was affected by the 1967 riot. And here's a map of all the buildings that were involved. Using my research on newspaper cuttings and first-hand accounts of riot events, I restructured the historical buildings according to the actual time sequence of riot events. Here I will briefly introduce that in 1967, the main in Central, the Garden Road and the Hilton Hotel was actually the main riot place. And it actually spread out to the Beaconsfield Hotel, which is already torn down, and the Bank of China building. The two buildings are literally at war, or one plays communist propaganda, the other plays Beatles music to as like a propaganda thing. And that riot actually started in Hilton Hotel, and then the riot police pushes the rioters all the way to the General Post Office, which is where the shrine was originally had. And so my game level is actually what I did here is I actually remodel the buildings of Old Central and then transform them into perspective sets that narrate the events of 1967 riot. I'm going to show a walkthrough into these sets later. Behind each of these perspective sets, there are reimagined building interiors of the old buildings that I redesigned it to tell the story of and the events and the places of 1967. And here I should try to show like a basic walkthrough into this a video that I record that goes into the building. Here I started up in the Murray House, which is a barracks office, and the game actually wants you to look for evidences that could tell the story of 1967, and that is the officer room of a corrupted officer, and you're supposed to find evidence of this corruption, and I used the building to hide the evidence, and then he has to follow through this rope which guides him to the journey of my story. So as he walks out, he reaches this place, which is where Garden Road is. And a design stage sets that comes into perspective only in certain position, and this one shows the aerial view of Hilton Hotel actually. And then everything is actually scripted, and the next stage set provides the facade of the Hilton Hotel. And then you proceed with the web. And fast forward that. And that is some evidence of what happened on the May 22 of 1967. And then you come into the Hilton Hotel lobby. And this is also a perspective set, which is only correct when you step it in. But as you enter it, the illusion starts to break down.
And you draw your gun.
And so it's actually only a torch in the form of a gun.
Flashlight.
Supposed to
It's a
illuminate.
gun-shaped flashlight.
So here you go out the hotel and you go to one of the witness hotel room, which is on like the 10th floor, the closest floor that you can witness the riot down there. And this is actually an alternate path, which is like a backstage bridge that shows you what you have been through before that, the stage sets. It kind of like take you out of the story and see it in God view. Then you go back in and you are a person. And this tunnel is actually this one.
Visiting critic at HBU. Oh, you checked into last night.
And this tunnel is made so that you go smaller as you proceed. And it's actually not your body going smaller, but the place becoming bigger, so that later on your size can fit through that gap. And that is another.
So this is Alice in Wonderland as well.
But it's the title of the piece is Stephen looking.
Yes.
So the material, finish is a real imagination for that.
There is an image, and you have to convert it into a bitmap and then import it into the game.
So, yeah, did you want to make some link with the rabbit or a bee?
I don't actually. I use 3D Max, the game engine, and the rest of the video basically shows how you proceed to the different buildings that I have transformed. And here, this thing actually shows the actual central that I have transformed before, and that is the CKC building. Is where the Hilton Hotel is, and this entire journey takes you through all the way to World Wide House. And I think the next important thing is how I make those perspective sets. And what I did was I studied the games room, which is the kind of room where you look into it, and two persons of the same size are almost, I mean, they're different. When you look through a viewport, and the two guys is very different in size, but they're actually the same size. And I took that mathematical principle and created distorted forms from the original buildings of 1967. And it actually essentially creates like distorted forms, copies of the original object that could be only accessed visually from a particular viewport. Here I will show it. This is actually central method, and the two person being of the same size. It looks like this is a facade which is almost complete, but as you move away, it becomes a distorted building that actually encrypts certain information because you can only see the correct information from a certain point. It ties in the original facade, the distorted facade, and that point of view as one single thing. And I proceed on to use the game engine to test what it can actually do when you do it, when you run and see these forms and human perspective using body motions.
That's kind of a cubist problem. Not the something 100 years old.
Yes. But here is, I'm trying to show that when these sets, when you order it into a line, a route where you can walk through, it actually creates an experience where buildings deconstruct themselves and then reconstruct them again on the next point, which is correct. And that is how the kind of method that I use to push the data forward in the game level. Like, so they want to actually see what is the next frame that is going to combine together to show you that information. And here I tested out with a different speed, which is MTR, using an MTR to restrict my views within the volume of the train. And this is basically another level which you can only look through this viewport, but these sets come into focus. And this kind of this level is kind of introducing the different buildings that were once in Central. And the last level that I did was actually the real Central, but I designed kind of a pavilion which is located above Exchange Square. And here, I line up several mirrors, and in the middle, I put in sets that when you look through it, you can see the old buildings which actually reside on the plots that we are staying now. And these are like the old facades that I modeled using from historical images and find their locations on maps. And that's like a overall view of it. That's all.
So I'll jump in because I want to pick up on what Michael said about Cubism. So Cubism, 100 years ago, allowed us, or helped us discover that we see the world in a sequential way, which you've shown in some ways, as well as seeing the world simultaneously. That's both analytical and synthetic Cubism. And we're at a moment now, I've written about this, it's a kind of thick moment, where we're interested simultaneously in the past, as well as trying to understand the present in its potential projection into the future. And what I find really exciting about this thesis is every city has a history, and there are remnants and fragments of that story. And you've been able to allow us to see the city again, where the past is now projected on the present, and the implication is about the future. So I would call this a thick moment, a thick now. And it is, you know, I would argue that this is enhanced reality. This is a situation where you are positioning yourself in some, I mean, you've picked one narrative, but you've daylighted a story that exists latently in the present. And I wish our cities, in many ways, as architects, were trying to recover those stories and reveal those multiple narratives. Now, I'm not sure whether you have to wear one of your friends' special glasses to have this story emerge, or whether this would be, you go to some place in the city